So I was in Canada at this Great Lakes International Chloride Forum, and there was this statistic that came out that just shook me. And it was simply this: in Canada, in 2009, this is the last measurement they had done, they had used about 7 million tons of salt, road salt. When I was running the largest snow operation in the country, so that following year in 2010, I remember this, there was sort of threat of a salt shortage, and there's been a couple, the inventory shortage. That year I had ordered what we knew we needed at least 1 million tons. And so yesterday, for the first time, I had full context of just as one company in the United States, just one company, we serviced 102 snow markets at that time. But, so I represented 15% of the entire use in Canada. So that shakes me. So here's what I decided to start doing a few years ago, and I wanted to share this with you, and then this has really become the foundational knowledge for me on where I think the model needs to go, particularly on the private side. So keep in mind, this research that I did as part of my studies at Harvard was a sustainability analysis of the commercial winter management industry's use of salt. So even though we're starting with municipalities, with a municipal focus, this is not where this stops. If anything, this is going to continue to compound, because this is a chart I've been sharing all across the country. And actually yesterday, the folks in Toronto were very interested in this chart. So this is your salt rise and contamination in Lake George. Quite a few environmental agencies across the border sort of represent Adirondack region as not having a problem until they saw this chart yesterday. So it was interesting that they now see that we're recognizing this too. But the bottom line is, in the 3 decades where you've seen 3 times the rise, you actually haven't had one new single road built. So there's a rise in expectation, we know, but I think there's also a rise in some of the density of parking lots. And so this was the next thing that really highlighted it for me. In New Hampshire, when they wanted to expand the I-93 corridor, which sort of joins Boston to let all those folks go up into the resort areas, the lake districts, the EPA stopped that construction from happening and mandated that the New York DOT come up with some sort of plan to reduce their salt use, because all the watersheds that were adjacent to that road system were highly contaminated, well above any acute chronic levels that the EPA sets. They came back with an interesting study that actually says, is there a pointer on this? Is that the green button? Yeah. Well, no, we're actually less than 10% of the problem. So look where it's coming from. So then that immediately points, it shifts the target from the municipals and the DOTs to my industry. So I sort of had multiple defense reaction to this, because one, this is pointing to my industry, and two, I do sort of consider myself an environmentalist as well. But given that, so what are we going to do about this as an industry? So here's one of the issues that comes to light then. So this is a big question. My industry, the private side of the industry, is a very low barrier to entry industry. So it's described in many different ways, but the level of professionalism, knowledge, experience, it's very diverse, okay? So you're talking about, I used to be one of these guys, but chucking the truck all the way up to, I was close to a $2 billion company at the time. I ran $200 million worth of snow, believe it or not. But this is really what the industry looks like in general. So this is who's applying all this salt. So a lot of it is very independent, entrepreneurial, independent operators, okay? So how are we gonna how's this message gonna reach them? And it struck me again, just this week, I was down in Connecticut, as Chris said. So I was actually speaking to a very prestigious peer group in the industry that had 7 of the top 100 companies that are part of this peer group. And we spent about an hour just talking about this issue before I got into another couple hours of overall sustainable winter management. And after I spent that hour of background, showing them this chart and showing them a lot of what you're going to see right now, I asked them, so raise your hands. Before I just shared this with you, how many of you were aware of this? No hands went up. Why I'm really embarrassed about that, though, is 2 of those companies, so this is 7 companies, about 50 people in the room, 2 of those companies have been clients of my consulting firm for 5 years or more. I know I've talked to them about this, but obviously I wasn't getting the message across. So this is quite representative of the challenge that I think we're going to have moving forward, okay? So let's keep in mind, like in the context of Lake George, and you hear like a private parking lot will be even the one that we're all parked in right now. So this is where we're going to need to go to next. And I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong here, but I'm just saying it's representative. So let me just sort of dive in as quickly as I can. And so what I wanted to do was say, okay, so I've got a lot of ideas and assumptions and experience that I think I can relate to this, but I don't come from academia. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, and so I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to start to tackle this. So luckily I had already sort of gained a lot of interest in sustainability. I'd already sort of entered into this program, so I brought this to my advisors at Harvard and said, I think this is what I want to help solve, but I don't know how to do it. I also have to give a lot of credit. He's acknowledged pretty well in my thesis, but that guy right there, Kib, was also one of my advisors. So he spent many sort of sleepless nights sometimes. Like for Kib, I still don't know what the hell I'm doing here. You got to help me out. So he was a big help as well. So I just want to share that. Chris, you were part of these conversations as well, so I just want to give credit here. But so what I ended up doing was I thought I was going after one solution, and then I ended up going after a different one, and I'll share with you why in a couple slides later. But so I did 3 methods of analysis: comparative analysis of salt application rates, which I think is going to be interesting. So Bill, you sort of helped with this conversation. And I then performed what's called a PESTLE. So looked at all the political, environmental, technological, legal, all the different issues that surround this industry. So I really started coming up with the goal of, can I provide sort of a broad context analysis of what this private industry looks like and why it's applying salt the way that it is? Why is it behaving the way that it is? And so I was sort of forewarned by my advisors early on, keep in mind, if you keep going down this road, you're going to find a rabbit hole that includes human behavior. Do you really want to go down that rabbit hole? And I sort of decided, well, not exactly. That sounds like a lot to tackle, especially, simple mind like mine. Then I tried to just rank all the issues, and I couldn't really figure it out at first. And so it was interesting. Even my advisors at Harvard weren't really familiar with the materiality analysis. So this is really more of a business model of how you sort of look at all your issues and then try to prioritize it. So you can almost look at like a SWOT analysis. So here's how we did this benchmark of salt rates. So a lot of it boils down to the Sustainable Salt Initiative, which Rakib's company helped us measure salt application, real world, practical level, no manipulation. We just want to know how you're measuring, because the industry is suddenly being said, or being told, you need to reduce. And so what I sort of came to realize is, but reduce by how much? Like, we don't even know how much we're putting down now. Pam sort of mentioned it earlier. You hear a lot of 1,000, 2,000 pounds per acre, but it's all over the map. And then furthermore, most of the industry doesn't actually have a way to measure it. So it's like, how do you even really know that? So anyway, that's how much we've been measuring so far. And it's interesting, a lot of people are interested in tapping into this data set at this point now. Now, it's exactly the same way that we're measuring here in the municipalities. It's just that we're doing it in private parking lots instead. So here's what I came up with. This red line, this red trend line, is that sample group. The rest of these lines are different matrices that look just like this, that exist all over the country, but for parking lots. So what a lot of different organizations have tried to do is say, well, let's do it how the roads do it. So let's just take their rates, and what they do is they convert a lane mile into an acre. So like a good representation of that is like, this is the one that they came up with in Minnesota, which Pam mentioned that earlier. The problem with this potentially is, and this is a friendly debate I have with them all the time, is, but a road, the conditions on a road are not the same as conditions in a parking lot. So you don't, one big one is you don't have traffic necessarily. You don't have the type of friction that occurs in a parking lot like you would in a roadway. So that's one sort of issue there. And then furthermore, it's never really been validated other than just a conversion. But so let's look at a few others. So SIMA's, Snow and Ice Management Association, they have their own set of recommendations. This one, however, and keep in mind, I had a lot to do with this, but that really is just a survey asking members, how much do you put down? And again, asking members how much do you put down that don't measure. So it's quite a bit subjective. And they realize that, but you got to sort of put something out there. So these recommendations used to be way up here, actually, so it's come down, just because we have a lot of this data now. Then you have New Hampshire and their Green Snow Pro. These are the rates that they train on in their Green Snow Pro certification. So again, it's taking it just like a matrices like this, and then it's just converting it to this chart so you can just see them all together. And then what you have here is, this is the University of Waterloo study. And this is really the only other one that is truly validated. So it's a control though. They did it in a 900 stall parking lot. That guy over there again was the original research associate, so blame him on but furthermore then, what we start to see that we've never been able to see before is, so here is a representative baseline of how the industry could accept rates, because this isn't necessarily random. This is a bit cherry picked. So these are either current VASIS clients or people that had signed up for the Sustainable Salt Initiative, which we wanted to brand it as something, and so that's what we called it. If you want to measure your salt and include it with this baseline, let us know and we'll include you. So that's what we did. But these are more representative of the best that are already aware of the issue and are already trying to implement methodologies to reduce their salt. So just keep in mind that a lot of the industry is still somewhere off this chart. Yes, there's a few that are down below. And then what we also have now is this line here and New Hampshire are quite linear. So we already have now the makings of the first sort of initial opportunity to standardize rates. So what does that mean to you? Probably not much on the municipal side other than you have the opportunity to sort of benchmark yourself the same way. Because there's just as many sort of matrices out there on the DOT level that don't all look the same. So you're going to kind of want to know where you are. So the nice thing is in Lake George, you've already established your own model. You already have your line, if you want to look at it as sort of a region now. So then I said, well, then let's take the other issue here. So what are all the drivers that influence how the private industry applies salt? And so I try to simplify it as best I can in this model. So here's what they are summarized. And the one aha moment that I got out of this, so the most difficult challenge I had was removing my bias as a contractor. And so I was constantly advised on how to do that, but I knew I had because my primary hypothesis was liability. So slip and fall claim liability is something that's plaguing our industry. I figured liability would be the number one driver. And this research tells me it's not. It's a contributor, but it's not the number one driver. It's not actually number 2 or number 3. It's somewhere number 4 or 5, depending on how you want to look at it. Up in the top right-hand corner, these are the top 3 opportunities. And so I'm going to get into, we're already doing a good job here on awareness and education. I think that we need to expand it now, though, to the private properties. So this is where it's going to really carry through. I think a lot of what Brittany was talking about earlier, that's a lot of the awareness campaign that needs to happen. Because again, we are talking about human behavior. People expect what they expect, and it just keeps going up. So this is the picture that sort of changed my life for a year. I thought I was near done research, and then I actually shifted gears. Kip had a lot to do with helping me think through this. But I thought I was going to go after how well does brine work? Douglas actually gave me a bunch of equipment to try and experiment with it. We actually did it out in parking lots, and then this picture happened. So this is after implementing all of the solutions interventions, brine, using all the right equipment, and then getting the phone call from the customer saying, we got a problem. What's that? I don't see any salt out in the parking lot. Well, it's blacktop. So this is not snow, this is salt. Well, we have blacktop. Yeah, but we got, just in case. Okay, so I have to call the company up and we're like, I guess they want more salt. So we had used brine, the whole deal didn't work. Keep in mind, this picture is 2 days after the salt was applied. So what's interesting to me is, so this is going to go back to human behavior or human expectation. We've gone over the last 3 decades from white hard-packed roads expectation to blacktop roads expectation to white roads again because they want white from the salt residue. That's where we've gone.
Crazy.
Anybody disagree with that?
No.
So that's one of the trickiest things that we're going to have to look at now. So what I'm advocating for is, how are we going to sort of change business as usual? So again, who in here are contractors? Is there anybody? Yeah, we got one. This room needs to double in size and put contractors in the room. Not just contractors though, I think it's going to need to be, where's the property owner even at this building? So it's the principles of sustainability that I advocate that we need to leverage. This is not just an environmental issue. There's a lot of economic issues and opportunities that I think we can leverage with this, and then social reputation issues. This right here is social. That's what we're dealing with here. It's nothing more than that. That's what people think that they want or think that they need. So you've seen this before. We described it as the prescription to reduce. What I'm sort of bringing to the table now is like, this is the model for policy. It's standards of policy that will enable the standards of best practices. But this is really where we're missing. And so the difference between private and public is, in a lot of cases, the DOTs, you as the municipality, you actually control your own policy. Private contractors do not. So the policy of level of service at this property is different than the next one, is different, the next one is different than the next one. So they're dealing with potentially, if you have 100 clients, you're dealing with potentially 100 different versions of level of service expectation and policy. So just quickly going through it again, this is how you're measuring. If you don't measure, you can't improve. Peter Drucker said it, not me, but if you can't improve what you don't measure, right? Calibration, just simply knowing what's coming out of the back of the truck, and then Kip's already showed you. And then you may think you've calibrated all your trucks the same, but then you've already seen the variability, right? So no two trucks actually act alike, no two operators act alike, so we have to sort of take that variability out of it. Prevention, that's the anti-icing. I think Pam said more than I could ever say on it. There's nothing different there other than I have a slightly different frying pan. But this is really exact. This alone helps me go to property owners and say, would you do this? Well, no, not if I can avoid it, right? That is what you're having your contractor do in your parking lot, though. And for some reason, you don't trust them to do something preventative because it seems like it's like this extra service or this extra cost. It's really not. It's actually meant to save you money in the long run. We've already gone through the analysis process when we were kids, so that's what you're doing though. So there's your variability again. You've already seen it 100 times this morning. So, and then optimization. So like, how are you going to improve from there? Paul's showing you the live edge. We've already talked about the pre-wetting at the spinner. Activating your solid salt so it's more efficient. So the answers are pretty clear. It's just a matter of, again, how are we going to enable it with policy? So I want to go back and look at this materiality analysis again and then say, so this is really what it's going to boil down to is we're going to have to deal with, you've all heard it before, expectation versus reality. You know, whatever the gap is between those two, you know, I've started to learn over the years, it's called frustration, right? So we need to narrow the gap. We're frustrated because of what this is doing environmentally. Property owners are frustrated if they don't have, you know, blacktop. And I also think, you know, the other thing to this is, going back to this picture, there's another reason like why this picture happens. And that's why I wanted to stress, a lot are saying, well, again, it's because people are afraid of slip and fall liability. I'm like, well, I think even if you, this is both my personal opinion and then I believe it's now been validated with this research. If you took the liability away, it still doesn't, it doesn't change the fact that people are used to having this now. And so there's this other thing that starts to happen, particularly on the private side of the industry. It's a very competitive industry too. And then our clients are usually in competitive industries as well. So if you think about just in Lake George, if you had a Rite Aid and a Walgreens, or a McDonald's and a Burger King, you know what happens, they're always across the street from each other. They're on competing corners, right? Walmart wants their blacktop before Target. Rite Aid wants their blacktop before Walgreens. Because it's perception now, like, must be safer in there, looks better, so like, how would you measure the quality of snow management? Other than seeing the blacktop, how else do you measure quality? Anybody tell me a different way? So that's what they're after. And again, the argument was, well, that's because of liability. Well, no, I think liability sometimes is the excuse, sometimes it's the reason, but it's more so you took the liability away, there's something wrong with that. It's no different than, you know, I've been in sports turf for a long time too, and you know, Fenway Park years ago, the turf looked like crap. If you look at old tapes, the turf was nothing. As soon as they started to elevate how that turf looked, then the colleges wanted theirs to look that way, then the little leagues wanted theirs to look that way, and then you wanted it right in your backyard. The same thing happened with golf courses years ago. The same thing's happening in the parking lot. New Hampshire started using salt. You had the Olympics here in 1980. They wanted to make sure that people could have blacktop as they're driving up, and then that expectation never changed. It doesn't go away, and it just increases. So we know this. Let's look at something else. So the economic factor is, on the private side of the industry, am I okay with time?
Yeah. Okay.
On the private side of the industry, less than 20% of the contracts, or the terms of the contract, how we're paid, incentivize efficient winter management. So there's a lot of time and material, by the amount, by the application. So if I'm a contractor, and that's how I make revenue, think about this, I'm a landscape contractor, that's my quote unquote core business, but now I gotta do this snow thing to keep the lights on. And I'm paid by the amount. You can give me all the rates you want, you can give me all the recommendations you want, but when I have a client that says I need to see more salt, and I'm being paid by that amount, we know what's going to happen, right? So again, it goes back to policy, including policies of how it's purchased and how it's sold. So like for instance, if you were a Walmart, this is what it looks like in their world. If you're a large municipality, this is what it looks like in your world potentially. A lot of municipalities, I don't know how many of you here, they do outsource, and they outsource by time, right? Hourly rates. So depending on the amount of weather, that's how it's gonna impact your budget. So what I advocate for is, there's a model that I've used for a long, long time on the private side of the industry, but it's just, how do you normalize the snow? So success should not be dependent on the amount of weather. Success should be dependent on the plan and the policy. And so just looking at weather and saying, okay, we know in general, so this is how I share it on the parking lot side, we know in general that average almost never happens, but we had it happen almost here, but then we went 50% over it, and then we went 50% under it. So again, if you're a landscape contractor being paid by the amount, right? And you're having a year like this, where there's literally half the winter, and keep in mind, salt, burning it off versus plowing it off is a whole lot more efficient too. Which way are you gonna go? I'm gonna go where I'm paid the most, where I'm paid by the amount, and where it's most efficient. So, although best practice would be clear it first, in a lot of cases, clearing it first is never happening. They're burning it off. So what I bring to the properties now is, so even if you're paying time and material, wouldn't you want to know in general what it should cost? And so actually showing people, so just, applying production rates even to a parking lot scenario, it can be done. We show this to clients. So before you bid it out next, and, sort of create this race to the bottom with downward pressures on pricing, which is happening, you should already know what it should cost so that you know that you have a legitimate bid. We actually did this little experiment at your property, right, at your office, at the Fun Flip George, before you bid it out again, just so you at least had a baseline of like what this should look like. So lastly, my next mission in life, I believe, is we've got this opportunity right now with sustainability, with green branding, that I believe the properties do already recognize. So I mean, most of you are probably familiar in some way or another with LEED. And so LEED really applies to the building. Leaders in energy and environmental design, right? But they don't necessarily understand how winter management or even landscape management for that matter applies to their building. So they had a really difficult time sort of putting in the context of the exterior. And so that's what I'm hoping to bring to the table next is let's leverage that they do recognize this. Sustainability right now is sort of at the forefront of every organization. Any organization that I can identify that has a chief sustainability officer or sustainability program or whatever, that's who I'm targeting. So I've been, Nate, who you're going to hear from next, we actually had an interesting conversation the other day, and he sort of said the same thing. Like, yeah, we got to get closer to the building on this, because that's where the property managers and the property owners sort of understand this the most. So I was really surprised. Thank you. I saw that a flyer for this was printed, but so what we're piloting this year with Wood Advisors is you already have the model here that we're going to try and experiment with on a certification level. We'll get more into that later on this season. But then we're also piloting this with a very large Northeast grocery store chain, Wegmans, and then we unfortunately don't have it here because the Wegmans family and the Golos who owned Schenectady years ago sort of had a handshake agreement. They weren't going to compete, and so they still honored that. But maybe someday, maybe some more people need to die or something. Or an acquisition. But so for the most part, though, this is a program for the properties. Because as I pointed to the direction to earlier, on the private side of the industry in particular, it's so fragmented that we'll never reach them all. The only people that actually have access to this entire industry is their clients. And so the hope is that and this is really my goal, is let's bring the standards of policy to the building that will enable contractors to implement these standards of best practices. So it's both a gap analysis and audit process all the way down to standardization of how we measure, and then making sure that they're still doing this. So that's part of the issue I think sometimes is you can bring a program to any company or any property, but if we don't verify that they continuously implement and improve, then it's not really a certified program. So that's really the model that we're going to experiment with this year. So with that, just a reminder again, I think we're going to go over this a little bit later, but these really are the sort of the basic stages or the standards of policy that enable the practice. So I'm happy to, I'll be here, the rest of the day or most of the day, so I'd love to answer questions if we don't have time now. And I love to talk about this, so if you just want to even email me and we could schedule time to talk or chat over email or whatever, but feel free.
No, I have a question. So you mentioned lead, Phill, and swim as a kind of a complement, I guess, of sorts. Can you talk more about what that certification model will look like? I mean, you're piloting it now.
Mhm.
What is it? Is it a matter of, well, you tell me, but is it a matter of subscribing to those best practices and hitting all the high notes in each dimension?
Yeah. So what does the model look like? So let me just sort of go back to the purpose of it for a minute. So, for example, is you heard Pam earlier talk about Brian.
Right.
Then the other side of this is the client side, the property side doesn't really understand it. And so my experience has been is when I work with the properties, they almost need this neutral third-party perspective, because many times the very good contractors, they are bringing these good ideas, but there's always sort of this underlying suspicion, like what's in it for the contractor. So my experience already has been, it's interesting, some of these best practices you're telling us we should implement on our properties, we've heard about some of this from our contractors. I'm sure you have. So why didn't you listen to them? Well, honestly, because of the contractor. So that's unfortunate, but a reality, and so that's what we're trying to bring to light is, so these are the basic policies that need to exist on your property if you want to save money and do better things for the environment. So saving money is sometimes just strictly paying time and material versus just a seasonal variance contract. Right there's opportunities to save money, because there's always waste in a time and material model, or at least the potential for it. Also, from a reputational and relationship standpoint, there's always sort of this underlying distrust, like, is what the contractor charged us really what they did? Because we don't really have obvious ways to measure. And if you think about it, that salt rate chart again, think about what that salt rate charges to the private industry. And then we say, so follow the guidelines, follow the best practices for the rates. Mm-hmm. It's like saying, so follow the speed limit. But we're not going to tell you which one, and you have to do it in a car without a speedometer. That's what's happening right now, right? So, but we're having a very difficult time already, I think, sort of making this change happen, and so that's why I'm advocating it will change at the property level. If we show them, if we're able to educate them, here's what the standards of policy are, here's what the best practices are, they want it, they just don't know where to get it right now. So they're going to places like LEED, and LEED is telling them things like, well, we've heard that like magnesium chloride, for example, that's a better salt to use because it's going to be less corrosive, less impactful on your landscape. And a lot of that's actually true in some ways, but then they also don't realize, yeah, but rock salt's NaCl and magnesium chloride is MgCl2. So we've just instantly added double the chloride, which is the thing that we're trying to solve. So there's a lot of misperception about what's responsible, and so this model is really just trying to bring to light, here's the standards. For an industry that doesn't really have standards, that's part of the problem. So like, here's an unbiased third-party way to both bring you the model, and then if you want to be held accountable, we'll certify it. But then every year we're going to make sure you're still practicing this way. So that was probably a long-winded approach to answering your question.
That's helpful. I'm just curious who will be you're still in the testing and prototyping stage, but this third-party oversight and review is going to be critical too.
Yeah.
Right?
I would say the prototype exists, and we have the ability to do it at the municipal level here now as well. I think where the challenge is going to be more is the adoption. And so then if there's ways, so I call it a prototype in that, yes, we'll find through early adoption that, so this isn't clear enough for you. You need clarification on this, or it'd be better if we had the process this way. We'll figure that out, but I think more importantly right now is like, could I talk to the general manager or the owner of this building even here right now and convince them that this is important? I think that's where I'm looking for a lot of help really, because that's the first step.
So, Well, just one follow-up to it. So, given the municipalities who've been front runners in what
Yeah.
we're doing here at Lake George, are they potentially, is this program, could they become, in other words, swim
They could be swim certified once we go through the whole process, which I think that's a little bit of what, you know,
We're trying to get to.
bring to light. So, you know,
Yeah, okay.
where are we at now versus where we need to go, so.
All right.
I think there was there any more on that?
No, that's good.
From our experience, and not so much the GM or the director, whoever's in charge of the property, or the superintendent, it's everyone below that who needs the training from the inside. When you get that snow event or that ice over, that, you know, you have them realize we don't need to blanket the property, you know, and one, you know, 2 or 3 passes to handle that one area. It's the owner's responsibility, you know, and most properties that say that on down, but you just don't see it. That's the problem. You know, once you sign on board with these programs, it's good, but it's educating everybody, not so much the contractors, but it's everyone on the inside too. You know, when someone comes in and there's, you know, works behind the desk, for example, there's a little bit of snow, and then the first thing they do is they call the contractor. You know, it's you know, it's what is your level of, you know, what do you expect?
Yeah. So it's a great point. It's been my frustration for a long, long time, and so that's where we're trying to look at this from a slightly different angle at the building level, getting to the property owner in particular, because that's who establishes policy. That's who establishes the first level of expectation that then trickles down. And you're right, the trickle down effect then is a bit problematic, because by the time the building engineer sort of understands or has their interpretation, all they're doing is saying, well, better safe than sorry, put more salt out so that I know that I'm safe even though I see blacktop. So there are best practices to address that though, but that's what we're not as an industry being allowed to practice right now, because there is no policy for that.
For example, in our policy for our company, we have, if you wear the wrong shoes, you know, that's your problem. You know, basically, like you advise them what shoes to wear.
Sure.
You know, for winter events.
Sure.
It come down to that.
Yeah. So it's part of policy.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else? Okay. Thank
Great,
you.
thank you, Phil.